Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Ivan, Mike, and the Independent Institute for the invitation to come and chat with you today about space weapons, arms control, and U.S. national security in space. I think we're all in agreement here that the integration of space-based capabilities with the terrestrial warfighting capabilities represents a new phenomenon. Well, it's not new anymore, but it's relatively new in the way that space is utilized for national security purposes. And that's fundamentally different from the Cold War context in which most of the arms control discussions that we were familiar with had taken place. The use of space in the Cold War period was for stability purposes, was for crisis stability purposes. But for today, and as Theresa mentions in the beginning of her remarks, they are targets, because those capabilities, if they're targeted, if they're destroyed, could gain an attacker a real advantage over the United States, whether in the short term or the long term, depending on the size of the operation. I would suggest that that's fundamentally a different environment that we're operating in, and that recognition of that environment has to guide our discussions about arms control. I'd also suggest that the relatively peaceful period that we're living in right now in terms of great power competition is not a sustainable one, when we ought to think about futures where the United States or other nations might be engaged in the kind of great power competition that has characterized human history. So I've been asked to address, I think, two questions. One is, why would somebody want to attack us in space? And then secondly, to speak specifically to the Chinese threat. And so I'll try to highlight both of those things briefly. First, as I've alluded to, the integration of space assets with our terrestrial power projection capabilities is both uniquely American at this point and provides a clear incentive to target American spacecraft. If I'm a potential adversary of the United States and I could take out United States precision navigation and timing capabilities, I directly impede the U.S. ability to conduct precision-guided warfare. If I can confuse our communications assets, then it's more difficult for my troops on the ground to talk to one another. I, as an adversary, and perhaps one with less qualitatively superior, or not qualitatively superior, but less quality conventional forces, need that advantage in order to level the playing field. Consequently, in my view, any state preparing for a geopolitical rivalry with the United States could reasonably be expected to pursue strategies to deny the use of these critical enabling assets in times of actual conflict, or possess the ability to threaten their destruction and to help shape times of international tension to their advantage. And it's my view that the Chinese example represents both sides of that equation. The Chinese test of their hit-to-kill anti-satellite weapon in January of 2007 captured the headlines, but it's hardly an isolated incident if one takes a long look at their program. General James Cartwright, who is now the deputy commander, or on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified before the Armed Services Committee in the Senate last year and put the Chinese threat in the proper context, and so I'll quote from him. He says, "The Chinese have undertaken what we would call a very disciplined and comprehensive continuum of capability against space. Our space capabilities," Cartwright noted, he also notes that the efforts range, quote, "all the way from achieving temporary and reversible effects to permanent damage exacted through direct descent ASAT and eventually core orbital space weapons. Further, the lower-end capabilities, he emphasized, were not only demonstrated, but actually fielded into their forces. This, he concluded, demonstrates that they have a very comprehensive vision for what they want to be able to do as a nation in their region." Now, let's talk a bit about what China's capabilities really are. It's difficult to judge because the Chinese program certainly is not as transparent as ours, but it is an integrated program, meaning they have their civil and military operations are functionally together. It's clear, though, that they have both the means and the motive to exploit space for security purposes. They possess advanced rocketry, they have a capable infrastructure, and they've demonstrated manned spaceflight, which is an indicator of great competence and the ability to operate in a space environment. It's also clear that they're investigating numerous weapons and weapons-capable elements. I've alluded to the direct descent system. As their rocketry becomes more powerful, they'll be able to reach higher and higher orbits should they choose to do so, maybe even possibly GEO with their most advanced ICBM forces. The kinetic kill vehicle that rides on top of that rocket and makes an ASAT capability possible obviously is already proven. And some analysts say it represents a major technological jump compared to where the US and the Soviets were when we were working on such programs. They have that capability. That capability is not going to go away. They're also working on a host of directed energy systems. Preceding the January 2007 test, there were reports in the fall of 2006 that they had blinded National Reconnaissance Office satellites with lasers. Their high and low energy laser program is well established and well documented and could be used for these purposes down the road. And then finally, I'll point out that they have a robust electronic attack and jamming capability. Lots of people are gaining that capability because they're inherently dual-use technologies. All those capabilities are currently held, and there's a host then of more speculative on-orbital efforts, such as the co-orbital ASAT capability that General Cartwright alludes to. Those things may be coming down the road. It's hard to say whether they will or not. That's up to the Chinese to figure out. But I would suggest, given my initial proposition, it's perfectly logical and reasonable for them to make these investments. They need to make those investments in order to level the conventional warfare playing field against the United States. Whether or not they actually anticipate going to war with the United States is unclear, probably low probability, but there will be strategic competition in the international environment going forward. Finally, I just want to make a few comments about a treaty. I presume we'll talk more about this in the question period. So I'll just say that when I look at a treaty environment, I think there are 4 characteristics that one needs to be able to answer positively that the treaty can provide. First, you have to be able to define clearly what it is you're trying to accomplish. I think, as Pete mentions, defining what a space weapon is a very difficult proposition. As I've tried to allude to in talking about the Chinese capabilities, if you really want to get at the core of the things that can threaten U.S. assets, you'd be dealing with either elements that are dual use, their strategic ballistic missile arsenal, which they're not going to negotiate away in the current context, or are used for commercial dual-use capabilities, such as their electronic warfare capabilities or their laser programs. I can't envision a treaty environment that will get rid of any of those capabilities. You have to be able to monitor compliance. That's a technical problem. I'm not sure that we can monitor compliance in this area. You have to be able to verify that compliance. That's a political judgment. That's something that we can debate about. And then finally, you have to be able to enforce whatever the penalties are that you want to put into place. From my perspective, is compliance observable? I don't think so. Are there significant advantages that can be had by cheating under this kind of environment? I think the answer is clearly yes. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to the question session.
I told Jeff, respectfully, that I wanted to go after him so I could disagree with him. Since the end of the Cold War, a lot of people in hardline think tanks, Defense Department, so on and so forth, have been looking at China as our next great threat. And indeed, if it were the next great threat, I think I would agree with Jeff much more than I do. But I don't think it's really quite logical to believe that China is going to challenge us militarily, and perhaps not even so much economically. Let's go back to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a different kind of animal. It tried to create a global economic system distinct from the Western system. It tried to create a global political system distinct from the Western system. In contrast, China learned a lot about the collapse of the Soviet Union. It learned that the Soviet way of doing things economically didn't work. The Chinese were heading into bankruptcy by the early 70s. We all know that. They learned that if you were going to prosper in the future, you really had to join the Western system cautiously, do it with Chinese characteristics and so on. But they have done that. They have joined the Western economic system. They haven't quite joined the Western political system. But today, we're in a bizarre situation where the US economy and the Chinese economy are tightly intertwined. We all know about the China price. The China price is the lowest possible price you can get for manufactured goods. It's not always in China, but they do manufacture a lot of goods for export to the West. They're in the business of Walmarting America. They're also buying a large piece of our national debt every year. If it weren't for the Chinese and the Japanese and the Saudis, we'd be paying much higher interest rates in this country because those countries are willing to buy our treasuries. We need China. We need their cheaply manufactured goods. We need for them to buy treasuries. In return, they need us. They have huge unemployment in China. They have a lot of uprisings, at least we hear about them, minor uprisings in the western provinces. They need to provide jobs. They need to provide some degree of prosperity. Why on earth would they want to challenge us in a military sense? That would simply, even if it didn't come to an active conflict, if things turned really sour with an arms race, it would poison the atmosphere. So I'm not sure we need to think in 20th century terms for the future. We're looking at global problems without end, and I don't want to do a laundry list ranging from global warming to runaway pathogens crossing national boundaries. We need a great deal of mutual cooperation, global cooperation in this century to support the planet. We have more than 6 billion people and rising on our planet. We need some high degree of cooperation, and I don't think we're going to have that if we, meaning the United States, pursues an arms race in space. And I underline that we're the initiators here. From the very start, right after Sputnik, Thomas Dresser White, Chief of Staff of the Air Force under President Eisenhower, said the goal of all Americans should be control of space. There's been an undercurrent ever since then that people who I call space warriors, and I don't mean to insult them that way. They're good people, they're patriotic, they're trying to protect the country as best they can, but space warriors have tended to believe that we should someday achieve the capability to control space in a time of conflict. Now, this really came out in the open in a big-time way after the end of the Cold War. By the late 1990s, we were talking about control of space in rhetorical documents, doctrinal documents, space dominance. It's no wonder that other countries, including China and Russia, India, are pretty wary of the United States. We have huge technical capabilities. Many people believe that we can do almost anything we want to. I don't for a minute believe that we could really control space, but we talk about it a lot. I don't believe we could dominate space, but we talk about it a lot. And this is the old action-reaction dynamic of the Cold War coming back. If we talk about doing it, other countries, like China, are going to react. I think it's time to break that 20th century paradigm and start working on, see if we can craft a treaty. I think it would be hugely difficult. I think Jeff is right. It would be hugely difficult. But we have refused, year after year, to talk about, in a serious way, talk about a treaty. We say, first of all, that there's no arms race in space. We don't say that quite so easily now because the Chinese did destroy a satellite more than a year ago. We say you can't define space weapons. That would be difficult, but how do we know we can't define it if we don't engage in serious talks? And further, we say we want to keep our options open. Since the early 1980s, countries in the UN General Assembly have voted overwhelmingly to ask the Conference on Disarmament to pursue a new space treaty. And in the Conference on Disarmament, we simply don't do it. We veto the effort. It's a complicated deal that's mixed up with other factors too. The Chinese haven't been all that great in helping that along, but we simply don't want to do it. I think it's time to turn that around. We could sit down and talk seriously for 2 or 3 years. We're so far ahead that we wouldn't lose any ground. We could call their bluff. You say you want a space treaty? Let's see if we can do it. And maybe after 2 or 3 years, we learn that they're really posturing and it's not going to be possible, but we have to pursue that. Why don't we pursue it? I link it to the old spirit of American exceptionalism, the idea, going back to the 1600s, that this new land was an opportunity for mankind to start the world anew, that by providential right, or perhaps because of civic virtue, we had a right to do anything we wanted to in global affairs. Now that American exceptionalism has waxed and waned. It reached a high point during and after the Spanish-American War, and it died down a lot after World War I. But there's been a real resurgence of it since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. We've seen it in a triumphalist spirit in Congress and on the editorial pages and in general politics. We've seen it in the thinking of neoconservatives, that America has won the Cold War and it's time for American hegemony. I think we've got to look hard at that. If we insist on applying that kind of thinking to space, we're going to have an arms race in space. There's no question about that, I think. And I would argue that the opportunity cost, again, the opportunity cost would be very great. How are we going to attack the global problems if we are promoting ourselves an arms race in space? Certainly, China's going to react, India's going to react, Russia's going to react. Who knows, maybe the European Union will at some point. We've got to look at ourselves very carefully. Are we the instigators of the arms race, not the Chinese? Thank you.